So, happy Easter, everyone. Easter, a time for hope, a time for new life, a time for joy, a time for chocolate and bunnies. And yet, as we sit here on Easter Sunday morning 2026 and we look at the world around us, we might wonder where that hope and joy is. Each day we wake up and we scroll through our phones and we're met with a global narrative of trauma and war and despair. Ukraine, Gaza, Iran, the politics in America, the politics here, and countless individual stories of bad news that bombard us daily. And suddenly, the hope and the joy and the peace of Easter can feel somewhat removed from reality. So this morning, I don't want to shy away from that. I want us to address it head on. And I want to take you on a journey and show you why a 2,000-year-old story about an empty tomb is actually the most grounded response that we can have when we see the world around us today, and why it is a source of hope for the future, despite the reality of the world that we're living in today. But before we jump too far ahead, I want to pause and take time to recognise that we are affected by the events around us, by the human suffering that we see, by the global trauma and by the abuse of power that we feel. These things affect us, and inwardly we groan because we know this is not how it is meant to be. But this is not new. And there is a very biblical response to this, which I think we've largely lost sight of in our attempts to put on that Christian smile. You know what I'm talking about, where we pretend that everything is okay. In the Old Testament, there is an entire vocabulary dedicated to processing this kind of feeling, and it's the theology of lament. There's a whole book called Lamentations, and the book of the Psalms, which is essentially the hymn book of the ancient Israelites. Roughly half of that is comprised of people expressing raw, unfiltered anger and confusion and grief directly to God. We probably don't read that half of the Psalms often enough. We prefer instead to stick with the Psalms of celebration and of victory. But in the Lament Psalms, you won't find the authors holding back. For example, in Psalm 31, there's a section where David is pouring out his heart to God. And I think it's really helpful for us in this cultural moment that we're living in. He says, "My eyes grow weak with sorrow, my soul and body with grief. My life is consumed by anguish, and my years by groaning. My strength fails because of my affliction, and my bones grow weak." Distress, sorrow, grief, anguish, affliction, and weakness. 7 different descriptions of emotional suffering that David is going through. And the poem, I think, is inviting us to name our emotions and pour them out before God. But in that list of 7, there's one that's a bit different from the others, groaning, because it's not just an emotion, it's an action as well. And the Hebrew word for that, groaning there, is anach. Anach, and it's a bit of an onomatopoeia. It sounds like the sound that you make, that you express when your emotions run too deep for words. Anach. The first time this word appears in the Bible is in Exodus chapter 2. And the Israelites are living in Egypt, and they have experienced a massive population boom. And Pharaoh views them as a demographic and national security threat. And his response is systematic enslavement. He puts them in brutal forced labour camps, and he forces them to help build his empire's infrastructure. And when that doesn't suppress their birth rates, he initiates a horrifying genocide against their young. And it's in that exact environment that this word anach first appears in the Bible. The Israelites groaned, they anacht. But this groaning is not just about the physical pain that they are suffering or the agonizing conditions of the brickmaking. It's also born out of an unbearable mental inconsistency. They know who their God is supposed to be, and they know the promises that they are meant to be inheriting. But they don't see the reality of that in their daily lives. The groan happens in that violent collision between what you believe to be true about the goodness of God and the brutality that you are actually experiencing or seeing. And I think the same is true for us today. When we flick on our phones and we read about some new horrific destruction of human life, we groan not necessarily out of lack of faith or a failure of optimism, but as a deeply appropriate human response to a world that is fundamentally misaligned with its own design. We groan because we know this is not how it's meant to be. And to understand that emotion, we need to go back to the original blueprint of the universe. And here we need to challenge a commonly held view about God before the creation, which is that God was a singular, solitary, incredibly powerful, but ultimately lonely being. And that out of boredom, or perhaps out of a desire for worship, this solitary monarch creates the universe. A lot of people think about God in that way. A lot of Christians, I think about God in that way. But that's not the biblical view of God, because what we find in the Bible is that God has never been singular or solitary or alone. In the very essence of the divine, before space or time existed, there was already a dynamic, eternal relationship between Father, Son, and Spirit. God is fundamentally a community of self-giving love, other-centeredness, and perfect intimacy. And if God is a relationship, it changes the entire motive for creation. If God is a community of perfect love, then creation isn't born out of a deficit or out of boredom or ego, but rather it's born out of an unbounded desire to share an already perfect relationship. A being whose very substance is self-giving love naturally overflows. The universe and humanity within it were created simply to be invited into the joy that already existed within the divine community. And I think the implications of that are absolutely staggering. It means humanity being included in that Trinity relationship was the original dream before creation even began. And Ephesians tells us that we were chosen in him, in Jesus, before creation to be adopted into that relationship. Which leads us to another paradigm shift in how we view the incarnation, because we often treat Jesus' birth as a human being as part of God's plan B, as part of God's rescue mission when we sinned. But if the ultimate goal of creation was to share divine intimacy with humanity, then Jesus' incarnation was always plan A. And whilst Jesus' death and resurrection was certainly a response to and a result of human rebellion, the act of the eternal God fusing permanently with a physical human body and bringing that human experience directly into the life of God, that was the original dream before the dawn of time. It was the intended climax of the human story, regardless of sin. The goal was always total inclusion. It was never just about observing humanity from a distance. It was about God participating in the human experience and elevating humanity into that divine life. And I think this is beautifully illustrated by Jesus when, age 12, he gets left behind in Jerusalem. You probably remember the story. And when his frantic parents finally locate him, he's sitting in the temple courts. And he tells them, "Didn't you know that I had to be in my Father's house?" Now, it's easy to miss this because to our modern ears, calling God Father is normal. But don't miss how absolutely radical and frankly scandalous this was. Because in the whole history of Israel up to that moment, through centuries of prophets, priests, and kings, no one had ever dared refer to God directly as their personal, intimate father in that way. And Jesus used the word Abba there. It means daddy. It's an intimate term. But Jesus here at 12 years old, he's not trying to be provocative. He's just simply effortlessly describing a pre-existing eternal reality. He's taking that infinite face-to-face intimacy with God, that eternal community of love, and he's dragging it into the dirt and dust of human existence. So if the original plan was this beautiful, intimate, collaborative family dynamic, how did we get from there to the groan of Exodus, or to the cross at Easter, or to the trauma of the headlines we read when we turned our phones on this morning? What broke? What happened? Well, there's one word: sin. And sin, at its core, is not our inability to keep an arbitrary list of rules. It is simply us refusing to be who we really are. If our true identity is dependent, delighted children of God, designed to partner with him in stewarding creation, then sin is the tragic, arrogant decision to say, no, I'd rather do it on my own. I want to define good and evil on my own terms. I want to be in charge. I don't want to partner. And the consequence of that choice is catastrophic. It blinds us to who we are and to who God is. Darkness, isolation, fear, bitterness, they all enter the human condition. And the collateral damage of that choice isn't just internal, it bleeds out into the physical world around us. Paul writes in Romans 8, verse 20, that creation was subjected to frustration. And he's using that word frustration there not to mean some kind of annoyance, but creation's inability to fulfill the purpose for which it was designed. If you picture a beautiful garden over which we've been appointed the gardeners, that's actually the image of the Garden of Eden. But we chose not to tend that garden. Instead, we've let it become overgrown and we've filled it with rubbish. The garden then is frustrated, in Paul's language. It has the potential, but it's not fulfilling its purpose. The trauma we see in the physical world is a direct reflection of our rebellion. That's what Paul's saying, I think. The problem is that we've lost sight of who we were made to be, and we've lost sight of the loving God who made us. But the good news, I'm coming to the good news. The good news is that God never lost sight of us. And he hasn't lost sight of the potential in the garden either. And he is determined not to lose sight of his original vision for our inclusion in that relationship. And ultimately, that leads to the events of Good Friday and to the cross. But as we approach the topic of the cross, we have to be aware of a massive theological wreckage which can happen when we approach it, having lost sight of the love and unity of the triune God. We can often replace that God with a schizophrenic deity, where on the one hand we have a bloodthirsty, uncompromising judge whose boiling wrath demands a violent physical punishment before his forgiveness can be legally unlocked. And on the other hand, we have a loving, merciful Son, so desperate to forgive humanity that he steps in and takes the bullet for us. We paint the picture like Jesus is carrying out some kind of divine anger management. But in that picture, we have misunderstood the wrath of God. God's love and God's wrath are two sides of the same coin. God's wrath is not the opposite of his love. It is the fiercest manifestation of his love. It is his love in action against everything that threatens to destroy his children. On the cross, God's wrath is not directed at us or at Jesus, but against the darkness, against the isolation, against the sin, and against the choices that are suffocating humanity. And I think we've held on for too long to this legalistic worldview where God demands punishment for sin before forgiveness can be released. So I want to take you back to a story right from the very beginning of the biblical text to allow us to reframe this narrative. It's the aftermath of the rebellion in the Garden of Eden in Genesis 3, the first recorded animal sacrifice. And if we hold on to this schizophrenic view of God, this story is often taught about God establishing a brutal, primitive legal precedent that says, because you broke my rules, because my honour has been offended, then blood must be shed. An innocent animal must be slaughtered to appease God's anger before he can tolerate looking at us. And consciously or unconsciously, that's how many people see God today. But let's look at what's actually going on here. Adam and Eve are hiding in the bushes. Why? Well, they're hiding because they are terrified, they're alienated, and they are deeply ashamed of their nakedness. And they try to fix it themselves by haphazardly sewing fig leaves together. So what does God do? God kills an animal to fashion animal skin garments for them, because he knows that fig leaves don't make very good clothes. Yes, an animal dies, but not out of a punitive legalistic demand for blood to balance some cosmic scales, but rather it is an act of profound, tender provision. God looks at a frightened, hiding, deeply ashamed humanity, and he takes a step towards them. He meets their immediate felt need for physical covering and dignity, and he absorbs the cost of their rebellion so that they can stand in his presence again without being paralyzed by their own shame. The shedding of blood in the garden is not a payment to God. It is the tragic, inevitable consequence of sin entering creation. Death is now a reality. But the act of clothing them is an act of pure, relentless, pursuing love. And in my view, I think that principle carries all the way through the Old Testament sacrificial system. Time and again we find in the scriptures God saying that he doesn't delight in the sacrifices. He's not interested in them. He's interested in people's response and their relationship to him. The sacrifices were never there to appease God. They were always there for us, to give us an assurance of his acceptance and forgiveness. The sacrifices never changed God's mind about us. They changed our minds about how we stood before God. And that leads us all the way to the cross, to Jesus, the ultimate and final sacrifice. God's mind about us hasn't changed since before the universe began. He wants us at his table. So when Jesus went to the cross, he did so to change our minds about God. We were the ones still hiding in the bushes. We were the ones projecting our own violence onto the heavens, terrified of an angry deity that we assumed wanted to crush us. The cross is the ultimate demonstration that there is no depth of human darkness, no horrific consequence of our bad choices that will ever cause God to abandon his dream for us. He steps fully into our violence, into our rebellion, letting human corruption do whatever it can, its absolute worst, to prove that his self-giving love outlasts our destruction. On the cross, he literally steps into our hell, the hell of our own autonomy, and he preaches God's love. This is not where you belong. You do not have to stay in the dark. And ultimately, he went to the cross to defeat death itself, the final consequence of our sin. And so we move on from Good Friday and we arrive at Easter Sunday, when the sun comes up and the stone is rolled away, and a resurrected Jesus walks triumphant out of the grave in a new and physical body. And the gospel writers go to great lengths to describe to us that Jesus was resurrected in a physical body. And that's significant because God's plan for rescue of human beings is not to escape this physical world and spend eternity on a cloud playing a harp. That image actually has a lot more to do with Greek mythology than it does with biblical theology. God's plan is not to burn the garden, but to restore it. And Jesus is the firstborn, the archetype of that new creation. What happened to the physical body of Jesus on Easter morning is the exact literal blueprint for what is going to happen to all of creation. And this is why we groan when presented with the headlines each day, because we know this. We know how the story ends. And like the Israelites in Egypt, we too know that there is a disconnect between the current reality and God's plan of restoration. It's the proximity of the promise that makes the pain so sharp. But the Apostle Paul in Romans 8, again, he beautifully changes this groan, this anach, from a groan of despair into a groan of hope. He describes creation as groaning, as in the pains of childbirth. Painful, yes, but with a purpose, with a future, and with a hope. And we can hold on to that hope because the resurrection isn't the end of the Easter story. When Jesus meets Mary in the garden after he's risen, he says to her, "Don't hold on to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father. Go instead to my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and to your Father, to my God and your God." Do you see what's happening here? Jesus, as a representative human being, is taking up his place in that eternal relationship. And he is transferring that relationship to us. He says, "My Father and your Father, my God and your God." From before time began, before the first star ignited, God wanted to share his intimate triune family relationship with humanity. And here, on the first Easter morning, that vision becomes a reality. Jesus brings his divine presence down into the dirt, suffers through the absolute hell of human rebellion, conquers death from the inside out, and then physically ascends, bringing humanity perfectly and permanently into the inner life of the Godhead. The theological symmetry there is stunning, I think. The incarnation brought God down into humanity, and the ascension brought humanity up into God. The original dream before creation is fully realized. A physical human being, Jesus Christ, is now seated at the right hand of the Father, and humanity is permanently included in that relationship. That's the stunning news of Easter. As I was leaving church last week, Emma came up to me and she asked me how I would explain why Jesus had to die to a 5-year-old. That's not easy. I responded by saying that when you're in the dark, it can be really scary because you can't see and you don't know your way out. It's no good someone calling to you from the outside. You need someone to come in and sit with you and show you that it's not scary, and then to lead you out. And because of all the bad things in the world, we can feel like we're sitting in the dark. And for lots of people, the scariest thing is dying. And Jesus came all the way into the darkness, even as far as death, to show us that God is with us and he loves us. And he leads us out again so we can see again. And because he was raised to life, that means we don't need to be afraid of death either. If he didn't die, we wouldn't know how much God loves us, and we would still be afraid of dying. Now, I don't know how well that would explain it to a 5-year-old, but I have a hunch that that might be quite useful to us adults as well. But as adults, we carry baggage, don't we? We've absorbed unhelpful ways of seeing things. And this morning, we've challenged some of those things. We've challenged our view of creation. Rather than it being an invention of a solitary and lonely God, we've seen it as an overflow of an infinitely joyful, shared life of a relational being. We've challenged our view of the incarnation. Rather than it being a backup plan triggered by human sin, we've seen it as the original intention of a loving God. We've challenged our view of the cross. Rather than it being satisfying the bloodlust of an angry God, we've seen it as God stepping into our self-made hell to heal our blindness. And we've challenged our view of our eternal destination. Rather than a disembodied escape to a non-physical realm, we've seen the biblical promise of the physical liberation and rebirth of this universe, which started with the resurrection of Jesus on that first Easter morning. So we can echo Peter's words in 1 Peter verse 3, 1 verse 3. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. In his great mercy, he has given us new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. And because of this living hope, God is restoring the garden. And we can take up our vocation as partners with him in that restoration. Though we groan, as in the pains of childbirth, it means our daily choices take on a beautiful new meaning. In every single act of love, of forgiveness, of justice, of creativity, of joy, of worship that we participate in, we are literally planting seeds of the new creation, right in the middle of the old one. We are inviting the future into the present. We are doing something with eternal consequences because we are participating in the life of the Trinity, in his purpose to bring all things together under one head, Jesus. And that is the glorious reality of a 2,000-year-old story about an empty tomb. And that is why it can bring us such hope, even in the midst of the global chaos that we're living through. So happy Easter. Happy Easter. Let's stand and sing.